Tonight we begin by stepping into a world where resistance was not about fists, weapons, or violent clashes, where the true power lay in peace, humility, and steadfast belief in justice. You probably won't survive this story without feeling some deep admiration for a man who reshaped the very essence of resistance and changed the world. This is the story of Mahatma Gandhi and his non-violent struggle for independence. A movement that spanned continents, sparked revolutions, and still resonates today. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're feeling chatty, drop your location and local time in the comments. It's always nice to know where you're tuning in from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Gandhi's story begins in the faraway land of South Africa in the late 19th century. It was here, far from the bustling streets of India, that a young Gandhi, then still just Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, had a moment of revelation that would change the course of history. In the midst of experiencing firsthand the brutal racism and discrimination against Indians, Gandhi realized that the only way to challenge injustice wasn't through retaliation or force, but through a method he would later call Satyagraha, or truth force. This was non-violence, yes, but not the passive kind that merely endured. It was active, dynamic, and incredibly strategic. Gandhi believed that by appealing to the conscience of the oppressor through truth and non-violent resistance, one could awaken their moral sense and bring about lasting change. He wasn't just up against systemic discrimination, he was setting the stage for a global movement that would span continents, fueling uprisings, revolutions, and social justice causes worldwide. Historians still argue whether it was Gandhi's early experiences in South Africa that truly shaped his philosophy, or if his exposure to Western thinkers like Leo Tolstoy and Henry David Thoreau solidified his commitment to non-violence. Perhaps it was a little bit of both, a blend of Eastern wisdom and Western ideas on civil disobedience. What's certain, though, is that this was only the beginning of his journey, a journey that would soon lead him to India, where the seeds of rebellion would be sown in a new, revolutionary way. As Gandhi returned to India, the air seemed ripe for change. British colonial rule had cast a long shadow over the country, and the people were disillusioned, disheartened by decades of oppression. But here's the thing. Gandhi wasn't interested in starting a bloody revolution. Instead, he chose a more unconventional method, non-violent resistance, peaceful defiance, that wasn't just aimed at the British, but at the very core of their rule. His philosophy wasn't just about refusing to fight back physically, it was about fighting back with dignity, moral force, and unshakable resolve. But even Gandhi, the quiet visionary, needed a stage on which to put this philosophy to the test. Enter the Salt March of 1930. What began as a simple act of defiance against the British monopoly on salt soon turned into one of the most iconic moments in the struggle for Indian independence. Gandhi led a 240-mile march to the coastal town of Dandi, where he would make salt from the sea, symbolically defying British law. The symbolism was as powerful as the act itself. Salt, something so mundane, became a symbol of British exploitation. And Gandhi, with his bare feet trudging along the rough Indian soil, wasn't just marching to make salt, he was marching for the dignity of the Indian people. As he walked, he was telling the world that freedom wasn't just about political independence. It was about the right to exist as equals with respect without coercion. Historians still debate whether Gandhi's Salt March was truly a turning point in India's struggle for independence, or if it merely accelerated a process that was already well underway. What cannot be denied, however, is the overwhelming power of the image. The world watched as thousands of Indians joined Gandhi, abandoning their passive compliance with British rule. The Salt March spread across India like wildfire, inspiring millions and forever cementing Gandhi's place as the leader of a revolution that didn't need bombs or bullets, only moral clarity and an unwavering belief in justice. As the Salt March rumbled through the streets of India, it was clear that Gandhi had tapped into something far greater than just a symbolic protest. The march wasn't just a protest against British colonialism, it was the beginning of a global conversation about the power of non-violent resistance. Gandhi's call to action resonated across borders and oceans, inspiring movements that would later alter the course of history. But here's where things get really interesting. Non-violence wasn't just a principle to Gandhi, it was a weapon, one that he wielded with a sharpness that cut through the silence of oppression. It was an active resistance, full of energy and purpose, but it never resorted to the use of violence. The power of non-violent resistance lies not in its capacity to destroy, but in its ability to create a different kind of revolution, one built on moral authority. Gandhi's methods spread far beyond the subcontinent, offering an alternative to the violence that so often dominated the global stage. In fact, historians often point to the fact that Gandhi's non-violent methods were not just a moral choice, but a strategic one. He understood that violence, while powerful in the short term, could never lead to true peace. True peace could only be achieved by dismantling the foundations of violence itself, and this was what non-violence promised to do. But it wasn't just about changing the minds of the British or the oppressors, it was about inspiring ordinary people to see that they too could fight back, but in a way that left no physical scars. Historians still argue whether Gandhi's non-violence was the sole reason for India's independence, or if the many other political factors at play also contributed significantly. Some claim that the British were already weakening due to the effects of World War II, and Gandhi's pressure merely hastened the inevitable. Others contend that the moral force of Gandhi's movement was what truly rattled the empire, forcing them to reconsider their hold on India. Regardless, the power of non-violence had made its mark, and it wasn't going to stop in India. With India now an epicenter of non-violent resistance, the ripple effects of Gandhi's movement spread far beyond the subcontinent, eventually crossing into the heart of the American civil rights movement. The idea of challenging oppression with nothing more than the strength of one's will and the power of non-violent action inspired leaders across the globe. In the United States, a young man named Martin Luther King Jr. was grappling with the same questions that Gandhi had faced decades earlier. How do you fight injustice without becoming part of the cycle of violence? King, deeply influenced by Gandhi's philosophy, saw in it a way to combat racial segregation in the South, a means to unite people in peaceful action for civil rights. The influence was clear in King's campaigns, marches, sit-ins and protests that, while peaceful, demanded immediate attention. But the connection to Gandhi wasn't just in the tactics, it was in the philosophy. King saw non-violence as the only way to truly confront the moral and spiritual evil of racism. It wasn't just about resisting unjust laws, it was about awakening the conscience of the oppressor. The power of non-violence, King believed, lay in its ability to bring the oppressor face to face with the immorality of their actions, forcing them to confront their own humanity. And like Gandhi, King was not interested in temporary fixes. His vision was one of true reconciliation, where both sides of the conflict could come together, not through force, but through mutual respect and understanding. Historians still debate how directly King was influenced by Gandhi. Some argue that King's use of non-violence was more a product of the Christian doctrine of love and forgiveness, rather than an adoption of Gandhi's methods. Others believe that King consciously and directly modeled his leadership on Gandhi's principles. Regardless of the specifics, the results speak for themselves. King's success in leading the civil rights movement, culminating in key victories such as the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, demonstrated the potency of non-violent resistance on the world stage, and Gandhi's shadow loomed large over those victories. Now, as the world watched the civil rights movement unfold in the United States, a new chapter of global resistance was beginning to take shape in South Africa. It was there that the anti-apartheid struggle led by Nelson Mandela took up Gandhi's mantle of non-violent resistance. Mandela, however, was operating in a different political climate, one where the oppression was particularly brutal, and the resistance against it was often met with extreme violence. Yet the core of his resistance was grounded in the same principles that Gandhi had espoused. Mandela had seen firsthand the power of non-violence when it was used strategically, and he understood its potential to challenge even the most deeply entrenched systems of racial oppression. Mandela's commitment to non-violence wasn't without its challenges. South Africa's apartheid regime, built on racial segregation and white supremacy, was fiercely oppressive and used force to maintain control. For Mandela and his colleagues in the African National Congress (ANC), the decision to turn to non-violence wasn't always a simple one. Some factions of the ANC believed that only armed struggle could bring down the apartheid regime, and for a time, Mandela himself was involved in organizing acts of sabotage. But as he spent more time in prison, he came to realize that non-violence combined with strategic resistance was still the most powerful weapon at their disposal. Historians still debate the degree to which Mandela's non-violence was influenced by Gandhi, and how much it was shaped by the context of South Africa's specific struggles. Some argue that Mandela's leadership was shaped by a need for practical, pragmatic solutions, given the overwhelming power of the apartheid regime. Others suggest that Mandela over time embraced Gandhi's philosophy as part of his long-term vision for post-apartheid reconciliation. Regardless, Mandela's eventual move toward non-violence played a crucial role in bringing about the end of apartheid and in shaping the peaceful transition to a democratic South Africa, which was built on the ideals of equality and forgiveness, core elements of Gandhi's legacy. As the world embraced non-violence as a tool for social change, another pivotal group entered the conversation: women. Gandhi's movement wasn't just about men marching and leading protests, it was also about the tireless efforts of countless women who played a central role in shaping the direction of the struggle. Women like Sarojini Naidu Kasturba Gandhi, his own wife, and many others didn't just lend their voices to the cause, they took up the banner of non-violence themselves. They sat in protest, organized strikes, and perhaps most importantly, helped shift the conversation about gender roles in society. Gandhi recognized that the struggle for India's independence couldn't be separated from the struggle for women's rights. Women weren't merely passive participants in the movement, they were vital, active agents of change. In fact, Gandhi's vision for non-violence didn't just extend to political issues, it was deeply intertwined with his ideas about social justice. He believed that the oppression of women was just as unjust as the oppression of the Indian people by the British, and he was adamant about the need to address both. This vision inspired generations of women worldwide to take up non-violence not just as a political tool, but as a social and moral compass for all areas of their lives. In the context of India, this meant fighting against practices like child marriage, dowry, and the caste-based discrimination that often sidelined women's voices in the fight for independence. Historians still argue about the extent to which Gandhi's vision of women's roles in the independence movement was truly progressive. Was he advocating for gender equality, or was he merely focusing on women's roles as mothers and symbols of non-violence? Some suggest that while Gandhi was radical in including women in the fight for independence, his views on women's empowerment may have been limited by the cultural norms of his time. Regardless, women played an essential part in the success of non-violent movements across the world, from India to the United States and beyond. The seeds of Gandhi's non-violent resistance didn't just bloom in the political sphere, they took root in every corner of society. One such fertile ground was Latin America, where leaders and movements inspired by the principles of Satyagraha began to challenge entrenched systems of injustice. The story of Gandhi's influence in Latin America is a fascinating one. From the Cuban Revolution to the anti-dictatorship struggles in Argentina, the spirit of non-violence subtly echoed in the resistance against oppressive regimes. The most notable perhaps was the non-violent activism of the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo in Argentina, who in the late 1970s took to the streets to demand the return of their children who had disappeared under the brutal military dictatorship. These women, wearing white headscarves as a symbol of their commitment to peace and justice, marched in silence, refusing to be intimidated by the violent regime. Their peaceful yet powerful resistance became a symbol of both defiance and hope in the face of unimaginable loss. Similarly, in Cuba, although the revolution itself involved armed conflict, there were elements of Gandhi's non-violent philosophy woven into the fabric of the movement, particularly in the early stages of the struggle against the Batista regime. Fidel Castro himself, influenced by Gandhi's methods, called for non-violent protests as part of his revolutionary strategy. Historians still debate whether Gandhi's influence on Latin American movements was truly non-violent, or whether it was more about selective application. Was the resistance in Cuba and Argentina purely non-violent, or were the revolutionary leaders simply borrowing the language of non-violence to inspire action while still utilizing force when necessary? Some critics argue that the reality of revolution often demands more than just peaceful protest. Yet the principles of non-violence, even in their hybrid forms, provided these movements with a moral backbone and a way to resist oppression without losing their humanity. The reverberations of Gandhi's non-violence didn't stop with major political revolutions or movements in the West or Latin America. As the world entered the late 20th century, his ideas continued to resonate in the most unexpected places, especially in the environmental and climate justice movements. Non-violence, once a tool for decolonization and civil rights, became an essential philosophy in the ongoing battle for sustainable development. From India to the United States, activists drew inspiration from Gandhi's example, rejecting violent confrontation in favor of peaceful protest against environmental degradation. Perhaps one of the most striking examples of this modern-day nonviolent movement can be found in the efforts of Greenpeace, whose activists often used nonviolent direct action to draw attention to issues like whaling and nuclear testing. Their use of creative nonviolent methods to challenge powerful corporations and governments echoes Gandhi's belief in the moral power of peaceful resistance. More recently, the global climate strikes led by youth activists such as Greta Thunberg have followed the same nonviolent path, emphasizing peaceful protest, civil disobedience, and the refusal to accept the status quo of environmental destruction. Historians still debate whether Gandhi would have approved of the way these modern environmental movements have incorporated his nonviolent resistance. Some argue that these movements have embraced Gandhi's methods in their purest form, using peaceful protest to highlight the urgency of climate change. Others suggest that the scale and the global nature of the environmental crisis might necessitate more drastic measures pushing the boundaries of Gandhi's vision of nonviolence. Yet regardless of the debate, the application of nonviolent principles to modern environmental and social issues proves that Gandhi's legacy is far from a relic of the past. His call to action continues to inspire those who fight for a better, more sustainable world. As the global landscape evolved, the essence of Gandhi's nonviolence continued to breathe life into movements that advocated for human rights, racial equality, and social justice. In fact, the resonance of Gandhi's philosophy is so potent that it can be seen in some of today's most significant movements for change. Take, for example, the Black Lives Matter movement, which has swept across the globe in response to systemic racism and police violence. Although the movement's tactics and strategies are diverse, at its core lies the very principle Gandhi championed: the belief that true power comes not from violent retribution, but from standing firm in one's moral integrity. What's fascinating is that Black Lives Matter, despite the challenges it has faced in the face of overwhelming opposition, continues to uphold the power of peaceful protest as a means of resistance. The "I Can't Breathe" chants, the die-ins, the powerful marches. These are all echoes of Gandhi's peaceful confrontations with power, an invitation to those in power to recognize the inherent injustice in their actions and to compel change without resorting to violence. Gandhi's influence can also be seen in the global youth-led movements calling for climate justice and economic equity. From the streets of Hong Kong to the protests in Belarus, activists have drawn on Gandhi's methods to challenge authoritarian governments advocating for freedom and democracy through peaceful means. Historians still debate whether non-violent movements, including those inspired by Gandhi, are truly effective in bringing about systemic change, or whether they are simply stalling tactics that fail to tackle the root of the problem. Some argue that while non-violence can expose injustice and rally public support, it may not always force oppressive systems to change. Others believe that Gandhi's non-violence remains a beacon of moral clarity in an increasingly tumultuous world, showing that lasting change comes when the oppressed refuse to perpetuate the violence of the oppressors. Whatever the case, it's clear that Gandhi's legacy is alive and well, continuing to inspire countless movements dedicated to justice and equality. And so we come to the enduring power of Gandhi's nonviolence, an idea that despite the challenges and obstacles of history, remains as relevant today as it ever was. From the peaceful streets of India to the contentious protests in modern capitals, the spirit of Gandhi's resistance lives on in the hearts and actions of those who seek change. Yet it is perhaps in this moment, in an era of constant global conflict and political unrest, that we truly begin to appreciate the timeless relevance of his philosophy. Non-violence, which once seemed like a radical departure from the norm, has now become a global rallying cry for those who long for a world where justice is achieved without the devastating toll of violence. Gandhi's legacy, however, is not one of blind idealism. His belief in non-violence wasn't naive, it was strategic and deeply rooted in a belief in human dignity. As he once said, "An eye for an eye only ends up making the whole world blind." His resistance wasn't about withdrawing from the world, nor was it about accepting the status quo. It was about confronting injustice head-on without stooping to the same methods of oppression. It was about creating a new kind of power, one that couldn't be silenced, no matter how many obstacles were placed in its path. This power, grounded in truth, was transformative not just for those who practiced it, but for the entire world. Historians still argue over whether non-violence can truly solve the world's most intractable problems, or if the world needs more aggressive action in the face of mounting global crises. Some suggest that non-violence might be a noble but ultimately ineffective tool for dismantling the entrenched powers of the modern world. Others, however, point to the successes of non-violent movements, large and small, as proof that Gandhi's vision remains a powerful force for change. Whether we see it in the peaceful protests of today's youth or in the quiet acts of defiance that continue to unfold in pockets around the globe, Gandhi's belief in non-violence has inspired generations to challenge injustice, not with the sword, but with the truth of their cause. As the gentle hum of the world outside drifts into the background, we begin to slow the rhythm of our story. In the quiet reflection that follows, remember that Gandhi's life wasn't about dramatic battles or heroic victories. It was about the quiet, persistent resistance against all that was wrong in the world. Non-violence in his vision wasn't a passive retreat from life's challenges. It was an active engagement with the world, grounded in the belief that true power comes not from force, but from moral conviction. Perhaps in this moment you can feel the weight of those small steps that add up to enormous change. Like Gandhi's long walk to Dandi, each step we take toward justice, however small, holds the potential to reshape the world around us. As we wind down the day, let this story remind you of the power of peaceful resistance and the lasting impact one life can have on the world. In the end, whether you're sitting in the bustling streets of India or the quiet corners of your room, know that the legacy of Gandhi's non-violence continues to guide and inspire movements for peace, justice, and equality across the globe. Let the whispers of his words be the change you wish to see in the world, carry you gently into the quiet of the night, where the dream of a better world rests.